Late one evening, a group of friends decided to explore the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It had long been abandoned, with the headstones cracked and weathered, their inscriptions nearly unreadable. Local legends claimed that the cemetery was haunted by restless spirits, but the friends, being young and adventurous, laughed off the warnings. Armed with only flashlights and an unshakable sense of bravery, they made their way past the rusted iron gates and into the eerie silence of the graveyard. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, the air grew thick and cold, even though it was a warm summer night. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, rustling leaves, soft footsteps, whispers. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. The group joked nervously, trying to brush off the growing unease that settled over them like a heavy fog. That is, until they came across a small, overgrown grave at the center of the cemetery, different from the others. The grave was fresh, the soil still disturbed, and the name carved into the stone was barely visible: Eliza. One of the friends, feeling an odd compulsion, reached out and touched the gravestone. The moment his fingers made contact, a cold, chilling gust of wind blew through the cemetery, extinguishing their flashlights. Panic set in as they fumbled for their phones and tried to turn on their torches. When they finally succeeded, the cemetery around them looked different, darker, more foreboding. Suddenly, from the corner of their eyes, they saw movement near the grave of Eliza. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees. But then they saw her, a pale figure, almost translucent, standing motionless by the grave. Her long hair hung over her face, and she was dressed in a flowing white gown. The friends froze, too terrified to speak or move. The figure began to slowly walk toward them, her feet gliding above the ground. As she drew closer, her eyes, empty black sockets, locked onto theirs. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, though no words could be made out. One of the group, driven by fear, broke into a run, urging the others to follow. They sprinted through the graveyard, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the heavy air. The further they ran, the more it felt like something was chasing them. The figure of Eliza lingered behind them, always just out of sight, but never far enough to feel safe. The gate was finally in view, but as they neared it, they noticed something terrifying. The iron gate that had once been open was now locked tight, as though someone or something had barred their escape. Desperation set in as they pounded on the gate, trying to force it open. It was as if the cemetery itself was keeping them there, trapping them inside. The figure of Eliza was closer now, her whisper growing louder, filling their ears with the sound of sorrow and anger. And just as one of the friends managed to tear open a gap in the gate, they felt a cold hand grasp their shoulder. The group managed to escape, but not without feeling the lingering presence of Eliza following them, her mournful wail echoing in the distance as they ran back to the safety of the town. When they told their story to the locals the next morning, they were met with silence. The cemetery was no longer a place for visitors. People whispered that anyone who ventured too close to the grave of Eliza never came back the same. And some say they never came back at all. To this day, the cemetery remains locked, abandoned, and untouched, but the legend of Eliza lingers. It is said that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can hear her whispering from the grave, waiting for the next group of foolish souls to wander too close. And if you do, you might just find yourself trapped in that cursed cemetery forever, with Eliza by your side.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the trees as the group of friends made their way to the old, forgotten cemetery. It was said to be the resting place of people who had met untimely, tragic ends. Many believed the spirits still roamed the grounds, seeking vengeance for their untold stories. On this particular night, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the very earth was holding its breath. As they ventured deeper into the graveyard, they noticed something strange. The tombstones, although weathered, seemed unnaturally well kept. Fresh flowers adorned many of the graves, despite no one having visited in decades. The friends laughed it off, chalking it up to coincidence, but the unease in their stomachs only grew. They came upon an ancient mausoleum, its heavy stone door slightly ajar. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, they pushed it open and stepped inside. The air within was frigid, and the smell of decaying wood filled their nostrils. They slowly made their way through the crypt, each step echoing off the walls. It was then they saw it, a large wooden chest, adorned with symbols they couldn't recognize, sitting in the center of the room. Something about it felt wrong, as though it had been waiting for them. One of them, a daring young man named Ryan, couldn't resist the temptation. He opened the chest. Inside there was only a mirror, old, cracked, and covered in a layer of dust. But as soon as the light from their flashlights touched the glass, the reflection staring back was not their own. The figure in the mirror was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It was as if it was waiting for them to notice. Ryan, shaking, backed away, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. It remained fixed, staring at him, its smile widening. As his friends called out to him in panic, Ryan reached out to touch the mirror. The moment his fingers made contact, a cold and clammy hand shot out from the glass, gripping his wrist with a strength that seemed impossible. His friends screamed, trying to pull him away, but it was as though the mirror had fused with him. The figure's face contorted in agony as it pulled Ryan closer to the glass. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and Ryan was yanked through the mirror, disappearing into the dark, cold abyss. The remaining friends, paralyzed by terror, didn't know what to do. But as they stood frozen in the mausoleum, something else caught their attention. The walls began to shift, the air growing thick with the stench of death. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and the echoes of footsteps filled the room, though they couldn't see anyone. In the distance, whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder. Voices all calling Ryan's name. They ran for their lives, stumbling over tombstones and brambles as they escaped the cemetery. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their homes. But even then, they couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery had followed them, that Ryan's disappearance was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the friends each had vivid nightmares of the cemetery. They saw Ryan's face, twisted in pain, trapped within the glass of the mirror, his eyes pleading for help. And then one by one, they started to disappear. First Mark, then Sarah, then Emma. Each time, there was a strange, distorted reflection of them left behind, as if they were never truly gone. The townspeople whispered that the cemetery wasn't just haunted, it was a doorway, a gateway to a place where souls were trapped forever, waiting to be replaced by others. And now, that same fate awaited anyone foolish enough to venture into its cursed grounds. No one visits the cemetery anymore. And though the overgrown trees hide the gate, some say, on certain dark nights, the whispers of the lost souls can still be heard, calling out for the next unwitting victim to come and join.
Story number 3.
It was a cold, moonless night when a group of 6 friends decided to test their courage and visit the infamous Hollow Creek Cemetery, a place no one dared to enter after sunset. It had been abandoned for decades, surrounded by stories of eerie happenings and ghostly sightings. The cemetery was believed to be the final resting place of the lost souls of an entire village that had vanished without a trace during a deadly plague. As they entered through the cracked iron gates, a sense of unease gripped the group. The cemetery felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with the weight of something malevolent. The trees surrounding the graveyard seemed to lean toward them, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. But they pushed on, laughing nervously as they explored the grounds. The graves were old, overgrown with ivy and moss, their inscriptions barely legible. But in the center of the cemetery stood one grave that stood out, new, freshly dug with a name etched into the stone: Eleanor Graves. Beneath the name, a strange symbol was carved, one none of them recognized, like a twisted spiral with sharp lines extending from the center. One of the friends, Jason, couldn't resist the urge to get closer. As he knelt beside the grave, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. A sudden chill filled the air, and he could feel eyes watching him. He quickly stood up, but as he did, he noticed something horrifying, his reflection in the gravestone. But it wasn't his reflection. It was the face of a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a blood-stained mouth. Terrified, Jason backed away, but the figure in the reflection began to move, its mouth twisting into a grin, its fingers reaching out from the gravestone, trying to claw its way into the real world. As Jason screamed, the others rushed to his side, but by the time they reached him, his face had turned ashen. His body trembled uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear. Then, as quickly as it began, the vision vanished, and Jason fell to his knees, gasping for air. He couldn't speak, only pointing toward the grave. His friends tried to comfort him, but it was clear something had happened, something terrible. They decided to leave, but as they turned to go, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The air grew thick, and a strange haunting melody echoed from somewhere deep within the cemetery. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of a lullaby being sung by voices that were far too many, too sorrowful, too unnatural. Panicking, the group rushed toward the gate, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The trees closed in around them, the whispers growing louder, filling their ears with unintelligible words, and then, one by one, they began to vanish. First, it was Laura, her body falling limp as she collapsed to the ground, her eyes staring at something unseen. Then it was Dave, then Rachel, each one taken by the unseen forces, their screams echoing into the night. Only Jason remained, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, each one speaking his name, calling him to the grave of Eleanor Graves. Desperate, Jason forced his legs to move, running toward the gate. But just as he reached it, something cold and bony gripped his ankle, pulling him down. Looking down, he saw a hand, a pale, skeletal hand emerging from the dirt, its fingers curling around his leg with terrifying strength. He screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand held firm, dragging him toward the ground. The last thing Jason saw before he was pulled into the earth was a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, watching him with those hollow, soulless eyes. The following morning, the cemetery was eerily silent, with not a trace of the friends to be found. The gate was locked, and the overgrown trees swayed in the breeze, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Some say the souls of those who dared to enter the Hollow Creek Cemetery are still trapped there, wandering the forgotten graves in search of others to take their place. And if you listen closely, you can hear their voices on the wind, calling for anyone foolish enough to step foot on the cursed land. No one dares to enter Hollow Creek anymore. But sometimes, late at night, a mournful lullaby drifts out from the cemetery, beckoning the next unsuspecting wanderer into its dark embrace.